In the blistering heat of July 1099, an army of starving, exhausted, and fanatical warriors stood outside the towering limestone walls of Jerusalem. They were 1,000 miles from home. They had marched for 3 brutal years across hostile continents. They had eaten their own horses, drank from disease-ridden puddles, and left tens of thousands of their comrades dead in the dirt of foreign lands. Now the holiest city on earth was finally in their sights, and they were about to drown it in blood. When the Crusaders finally breached the defences of Jerusalem, the violence that followed shocked the medieval world. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that the blood in the streets reached the ankles of their horses. Men, women, and children were slaughtered in their homes, in the streets, and seeking sanctuary inside their most sacred temples. By sunset, the city had been completely violently purged. For the people living behind the massive stone walls of Jerusalem, the sight of a foreign army at the gates was terrifying, yet not entirely unusual. Conquest was practically woven into the stones of the city. Every generation seemed to inherit a different ruler. Every faith claimed a divine connection to its streets. Every empire believed it could not afford to lose it. Compared to the massive, wealthy capitals of Cairo, Baghdad, or Constantinople, Jerusalem was actually quite small. It possessed no major harbour. It did not control the silk or spice trade. It had very few natural resources, and reliable drinking water was a constant struggle. Yet, what this small city possessed was something far more powerful than gold, steel, or grain. It possessed absolute meaning. For Christians, it was the exact location where Jesus Christ was crucified, buried, and resurrected. For Muslims, it was the third holiest site in Islam, home to the noble sanctuary and the rock from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. For Jews, it was the eternal capital, the site of the great temples, and the beating heart of their ancestral homeland. Across continents, countless people who would never even see the city oriented their entire lives around it. Pilgrims saved for decades just to walk its dusty streets. Kings invoked its name to justify massive wars. That immense, crushing spiritual weight transformed Jerusalem into a political objective unlike any other in human history. It was a prize that empires would gladly burn the world to control. This is the story of the city everyone wanted, the lives destroyed to take it, and the desperate struggle to keep it. The roots of this desperate struggle, however, did not begin at the blood-soaked walls of Jerusalem, but thousands of miles away in a world that was rapidly shifting and preparing for an unprecedented holy war. If you enjoy learning about history, subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and share it with your friends. In the comments, let me know where you're listening from. I would love to hear from you. Long before the European knights arrived to paint the walls red, Jerusalem had passed through the hands of the Romans, the Byzantines, and various Arab caliphates. For centuries under Islamic rule, the city had experienced periods of relative stability. Christian and Jewish pilgrims were generally allowed to visit their holy sites. But by the late 11th century, the geopolitical tectonic plates of the world were violently shifting. Pressures were building across both Europe and the Islamic world, setting the stage for a collision that would echo for a millennium. In Western Europe, society was undergoing a dramatic transformation. Population growth was exploding, increasing the demand for land and resources. A violent, deeply entrenched warrior aristocracy of lords and knights constantly fought each other for status. At the same time, religious reform movements were sweeping through the Catholic Church, emphasizing deep public devotion and the spiritual necessity of pilgrimage. Meanwhile, far to the east, the balance of power was shattering. The Seljuk Turks, a fierce nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, had recently converted to Islam and emerged as an unstoppable military force across the Middle East. Their stunning victories completely altered the political relationships throughout the region. They conquered vast territories, displaced established Arab rulers, and directly challenged the authority of the ancient Byzantine Empire. In the year 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuk Turks utterly annihilated the Byzantine army. This catastrophic defeat stripped the Byzantines of their most vital lands and resources, bringing Turkish forces dangerously close to the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. Terrified of total annihilation, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos swallowed his pride and sent desperate envoys to Western Europe, begging the Pope for military assistance. He asked for a few thousand elite mercenaries to help push back the Turks. He had no idea that he was about to unleash a monster he could not control. The Pope saw an opportunity not just to aid a rival Christian empire, but to unite a violent, fractured Europe under a single divine banner. That divine banner was raised in November 1095 in a frozen field in Clermont, France. Pope Urban II delivered what is arguably the most consequential speech of the Middle Ages. Standing before a massive crowd of nobles, knights and commoners, the Pope painted a terrifying, heavily exaggerated picture of the East. He spoke of Christians being tortured, of holy churches being defiled, and of the sacred city of Jerusalem suffering under the heel of infidels. He called upon the warriors of Western Europe to turn their swords toward a righteous cause. He asked them to march east, aid the Byzantines, and liberate the Holy Sepulchre. To sweeten the deal, Urban offered something unprecedented: full remission of sins. If a man died on this holy journey, his soul would bypass purgatory and go straight to heaven. The crowd erupted in a frenzy. They tore strips of cloth, fashioned them into crosses, and pinned them to their chests, screaming, "Deus vult!" God wills it. What followed was not a single organized military campaign, but a chaotic mass movement of humanity. Tens of thousands of people responded to the call. Nobles sought prestige, and desperate peasants sought to escape the crushing poverty of medieval Europe. The journey was a nightmare. The Crusaders travelled vast distances across completely unfamiliar landscapes. Hunger, disease, and brutal violence accompanied them every single step of the way. Before they even reached the Middle East, a rogue faction of the Crusaders slaughtered thousands of Jews in the Rhineland, convinced they needed to fight the enemies of Christ at home before fighting them abroad. This peasant army was eventually wiped out in Turkish territory. But the professional armies of the European nobility pressed on. They endured unimaginably horrific sieges, most notably at the city of Antioch, where they were reduced to eating weeds and leather. Against all logical odds, they survived. They broke out. They marched south along the Levantine coast, and finally their agonizing journey brought them to the very walls they had sworn to conquer. The city they encountered in the summer of 1099 was heavily fortified and fully prepared for their arrival. The Fatimid rulers of Jerusalem had poisoned the wells outside the city walls, cut down the surrounding trees, and expelled the local Christian population to prevent betrayal from within. Thick, imposing stone walls encircled steep, rocky terrain. Inside, defenders stockpiled weapons, food, and Greek fire. Outside the walls, the Crusaders were dying. The summer sun was relentless. Water was so scarce that men drank the blood of their dead horses. Every day the siege dragged on, meant more men dropping dead from dehydration and dysentery. The Crusaders knew that if they did not take the city quickly, they would die outside its walls. Salvation came in the form of arriving ships. Genoese sailors dismantled their own vessels to provide the Crusaders with precious timber. Working under constant arrow fire, engineers constructed massive rolling siege towers. For weeks, the outcome hung by a thread. The air was filled with the deafening sound of massive rocks smashing against limestone, and the chanting of priests begging God for victory. Inside the city, a mother carrying her children through the panicked streets could hear the rhythmic hammering of the siege towers, knowing that every strike brought the nightmare closer. On July 15th, 1099, the nightmare arrived. The Crusader siege towers finally reached the walls. Wooden drawbridges dropped onto the stone ramparts, and heavily armoured knights flooded into the city. The defence completely collapsed. What followed was the darkest chapter in Jerusalem's history. The Crusaders, driven mad by years of suffering, unleashed a tidal wave of slaughter. Muslims who sought refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque were massacred. The city's Jewish population, who had fled to their main synagogue, were locked inside and burned alive. Christian chroniclers celebrated the carnage as a sacred cleansing. Muslim and Jewish sources remembered it as an apocalyptic catastrophe. The Crusaders had taken the city, but their bloody victory birthed a generational trauma. They had carved out a new kingdom, but sustaining that kingdom would prove infinitely more complex than conquering it. When the blood finally washed away, the Christian leaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But the conquerors quickly discovered a harsh reality. Holding Jerusalem required a massive, exhausting effort. The Crusader states were a thin sliver of Christian territory surrounded by an ocean of hostile Muslim powers. Their supply lines stretched thousands of miles across the Mediterranean Sea. Every reinforcement and weapon depended on dangerous sea voyages. The kingdom's survival relied on a fragile network of fortresses, roads, farms, and coastal ports. Without them, Jerusalem could not feed itself or protect the thousands of European pilgrims whose donations kept the kingdom's economy afloat. To protect their precarious position, the Crusaders became master builders. They invested heavily in massive fortifications, constructing sprawling, impregnable castles like Crac de Chevalier. They also created new, terrifyingly effective military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These warrior monks combined religious fanaticism with elite military training. Yet, military strength alone could not sustain a kingdom. The population of the Crusader states was incredibly diverse, and Latin Christians formed only a tiny ruling minority. The vast majority were Eastern Orthodox Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Because of this demographic reality, daily life often required deep cooperation alongside the ever-present threat of conflict. Jerusalem functioned as a living, breathing, chaotic medieval city. A merchant in Jerusalem might purchase spices from a caravan of Muslim traders, sell those goods to wealthy Christian pilgrims, and negotiate taxes with an Italian official, all on the exact same day. Markets became neutral zones where political boundaries temporarily blurred. Over time, many Crusader nobles adopted local customs. They wore lighter, Eastern-style silk clothing, ate heavily spiced foods, and built homes featuring central courtyards. But the Crusader lords knew the truth. Adaptation was the only way to survive. They knew their entire existence depended on military supremacy, and beyond their borders, the Islamic world was finally beginning to unite against them. For the first few decades of the 12th century, the Kingdom of Jerusalem benefited massively from divisions among its enemies. Neighboring Muslim emirates constantly competed for territory and influence. This regional fragmentation gave the Crusader states the breathing room they desperately needed. But gradually, a new generation of ambitious Islamic leaders began to emerge, determined to unify their fractured world and expel the European invaders. The first major shockwave came from a ruthless warlord named Imad ad-Din Zengi. In 1144, Zengi laid siege to and captured Edessa, the northernmost Crusader state. The fall of Edessa sent absolute panic rippling through Christian Europe. It shattered the myth of Crusader invincibility. The Pope immediately called for a second crusade. Led by the most powerful kings in Europe, the world believed these massive royal armies would crush the Muslim resurgence. Instead, the Second Crusade was a spectacular disaster. Plagued by poor logistics and bitter rivalries, the massive European army crumbled. When they foolishly decided to attack the neutral city of Damascus, they were forced into a humiliating retreat after just 4 days. The failure of the Second Crusade left the Crusader states completely isolated. Their enemies had learned a vital lesson. The massive armies of Europe could be defeated. After Zengi's death, his son Nur ad-Din took up the mantle of holy war. He methodically unified the Muslim territories of Syria. He championed the concept of jihad as an active military duty to liberate Islamic lands. At the very center of his vision was Jerusalem. Nur ad-Din promised that one day he would take the city back. But he would not be the man to do it. That destiny belonged to a young Kurdish officer in his ranks, a man whose rise to power would spell doom for the Crusader Kingdom. That man was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. History remembers him as Saladin. His rise to power was neither sudden nor inevitable. In his early years, he was known more for his love of poetry than his military prowess. Through a series of complex political maneuvers, the teenage poet transformed into a hardened political mastermind in Egypt. Saladin completely abolished the centuries-old Fatimid Caliphate, bringing the immense agricultural wealth and massive armies of Egypt under his direct control. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin marched back into Syria, forcing rival Muslim lords to submit to his authority. The implications for the Kingdom of Jerusalem were absolutely terrifying. For the first time, they were completely surrounded. A single fiercely determined leader commanded the wealth of Egypt to their south and the battle-hardened armies of Syria to their east. Jerusalem was caught in a vice, and Saladin was tightening the grip. Inside the walls, the kingdom's leaders watched with growing dread. They were plagued by internal rivalries. The king, Baldwin IV, was a brilliant tactician, but he was slowly dying of leprosy. Noble factions viciously competed for influence around the dying king. One man embodied the worst of this arrogant aggression: Reynald of Châtillon. Reynald was a rogue Crusader lord who despised the truces made with Saladin. He launched brutal, unprovoked raids against peaceful Muslim trade caravans and pilgrim vessels heading for Mecca. Saladin swore a solemn oath that if he ever captured Reynald, he would execute him with his own hands. The actions of Reynald and the collapse of the Crusader leadership soon made war unavoidable. In the spring of 1187, the truces shattered. Saladin gathered an army of over 30,000 men, crossing the River Jordan, intent on drawing the Crusader army out of their defensive strongholds into an open confrontation. The trap was set, and the Crusaders walked right into it. In July 1187, the largest army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever assembled marched east. Led by King Guy of Lusignan, 20,000 men carried their most sacred relic, a piece of the true cross. They marched across a barren, rocky plateau in the dead of the Levantine summer. It was a fatal blunder. As the Crusader army marched into the arid landscape, Saladin's cavalry swooped in. They harassed the Crusaders with endless volleys of arrows and poisoned the few wells, physically cutting the Crusaders off from water. By the time the Christian army reached a dry, twin-peaked hill known as the Horns of Hattin, they were completely surrounded and dying of thirst. The night of July 3rd was a living hell. Trapped on the waterless plateau, the men were tormented by the sound of Saladin's troops pouring out fresh water just out of reach. The Muslim army set fire to the dry brush, blowing suffocating smoke into the Christian lines. A knight standing in the dark could feel his throat turning to sandpaper. By dawn on July 4th, the Crusader army was broken in spirit. When the sun rose, Saladin unleashed his forces. The desperately thirsty infantry charged madly toward the distant lake, only to be slaughtered by Saladin's cavalry. The elite knights fought bravely, but were completely exhausted. By the end of the day, the Crusader army was annihilated. The King of Jerusalem was taken prisoner. Reynald of Châtillon was brought before Saladin, and true to his word, the Sultan executed the rogue lord. In the ultimate psychological blow, the relic of the true cross fell into Muslim hands. The military backbone of the Crusader states had been entirely destroyed in a single afternoon. Castles and cities surrendered to Saladin without a fight. The road to Jerusalem was now wide open, leaving the holy city defenseless and terrified. News of the disaster at Hattin reached Jerusalem long before Saladin's army did, plunging the city into paralyzing panic. Streets were choked with terrified refugees fleeing from the fallen countryside. Food and water supplies became critically strained. Everyone knew exactly what had happened in 1099. They expected Saladin to return the favor with total annihilation. The defense of the city fell to Balian of Ibelin, who had miraculously escaped the slaughter at Hattin. Balian found himself in an impossible situation, with tens of thousands of refugees and only 2 fully trained knights left. He knighted teenage boys and common merchants to man the massive walls. By September 1187, Saladin's massive army laid siege to Jerusalem. Volleys of arrows darkened the sky. Siege engines hurled stones against the ancient walls. The desperate defenders launched daring sorties, but Balian knew the truth. Jerusalem lacked the manpower to survive a prolonged siege. When Saladin's sappers undermined a section of the northern wall, Balian realized the city was lost. He rode out to negotiate. Saladin initially demanded unconditional surrender, intending revenge. Balian responded with a terrifying threat. If Saladin did not grant terms, the Crusaders would burn Jerusalem to the ground, destroy the holy sites, execute their families, and fight to the death. Saladin, a pragmatic and pious man, relented. On October 2nd, 1187, almost exactly 88 years after the Crusaders had waded through blood to take the city, Jerusalem surrendered. What happened next stunned the medieval world. Instead of a horrific massacre, Saladin allowed the population to leave peacefully. He established a ransom system, and those who could pay were escorted safely away. Saladin and his brother personally paid the ransoms for thousands of the poorest citizens. The peaceful transfer of power in 1187 was a masterclass in mercy. But in Europe, the news of Jerusalem's fall hit like a meteor, igniting the most famous military expedition of the medieval era, the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade brought the absolute titans of European royalty into the conflict, most notably King Richard the Lionheart of England. Richard was a military genius, ruthless, brilliant, and fearless. Under his command, the Crusaders captured the vital port city of Acre. Richard then marched his army down the coast, maintaining absolute iron discipline. At the Battle of Arsuf, he handed Saladin a stinging defeat, shattering the myth of Saladin's invincibility. The Crusaders marched inland, coming within just 12 miles of Jerusalem. Richard could practically see the spires of the Holy City, but here, romantic legends clash with cold military reality. Richard analyzed the situation and realized a painful truth. Even if his exhausted army breached the walls, they did not have the numbers to hold it. The moment his army returned to Europe, Saladin would simply retake the city. In a moment of bitter pragmatism, Richard ordered his army to turn around. He refused to look at the city he could not conquer. The Third Crusade ended not with a glorious final battle, but with a piece of paper. In 1192, Richard and Saladin signed the Treaty of Jaffa. Saladin retained total political and military control of Jerusalem. In exchange, he allowed unarmed Christian pilgrims to freely visit the Holy Sepulchre and granted the Crusaders a narrow coastal strip. Both men were deeply unsatisfied. Shortly after signing the treaty, Richard sailed back to Europe. A few months later, exhausted by years of constant warfare, Saladin died of a fever in Damascus. The Titans were gone, leaving behind a legacy of warfare that would shape the region for centuries. But the city they fought for remained, enduring long after their empires had turned to dust. The contest for Jerusalem did not end with Richard and Saladin. Throughout the 13th century, control of the city shifted repeatedly through diplomacy, warfare, and complex regional struggles. The world around the city was rapidly changing. Global trade expanded, Mongol armies swept across Asia, and the crusading movement lost momentum. By 1291, the Mamluk Sultanate laid siege to Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold. The city fell, and the Crusader states were violently, permanently erased from the map. But Jerusalem remained. Empires came and went like the changing of the seasons. The Mamluks ruled it, followed by the mighty Ottoman Empire, who rebuilt its magnificent walls. Through all the violence, sieges, earthquakes, and shifting of global power, the physical landscape preserved traces of every era. In Jerusalem, history is not replaced, it is accumulated. A stone archway might contain Roman foundations, Arab modifications, Crusader battle damage, and Ottoman repairs. That layered reality explains why the city has always remained so difficult to possess completely. Every ruler with a strong army could control the physical gates, but no ruler could ever control what Jerusalem meant. For kings and sultans, It represented absolute legitimacy and imperial power. For pilgrims, it represented spiritual salvation. But for ordinary people within its walls, history was experienced differently. For merchants, labourers, and mothers, the central questions were about survival. The Crusades transformed Jerusalem, but revealed something enduring about the city. Powerful states invested catastrophic amounts of wealth and manpower to capture it. Armies marched across continents. Royal fortunes were drained. Hundreds of thousands died. Yet, history teaches us one undeniable lesson. Every banner proudly raised above Jerusalem's walls eventually came down. Every massive army that marched to claim the city eventually turned to dust and left. Long after the Crusaders, kings and sultans were gone, pilgrims still arrived. The furious arguments over who truly owned Jerusalem changed rulers and languages, but they never truly vanished. Jerusalem remained, not because it escaped history, but because it absorbed all of it.